Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. There is so much news to cover surrounding Iran. I don't even know where to begin. All I know is it's crazy, and I'm praying that we don't get what I think we're about to get, which is a full-scale war involving the U.S. Using those massive bunker buster bombs, and God only knows what this is going to escalate into. But joining me today to talk about all of this and where he thinks it's going and why he thinks it's happening, I'm joined by Dr. Benoit Kampmark, who was a WikiLeaks party Senate candidate with Julian Assange in 2013 and is a contributing editor to Counterpunch and several other places. So, Mr. Kampmark, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Oh, well, thank you. It's a pleasure being with you.
What do you think is the purpose of this that we're witnessing right now? Because, initially people said this is about nukes. But Tulsi Gabbard, the U.S. intelligence community, they all say that there's no nukes. And maybe there are, I don't know. But do you think this is really about nukes or something bigger here?
Well, I keep thinking of the comparison with the circumstances with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it's a very important point to remember. We're talking about the emperor with no clothes here. So we're talking about something where the weapons of mass destruction in 2003 that Saddam supposedly had, he did not have. He was deemed an existential threat. He wasn't. He was deemed to have the capacity in one, and the words were literally sexed up dossier that the British released to the Americans in the context of trying to beef up the threat of Saddam, that he had the capacity to launch a weapon in 45 minutes across Europe that would be a danger to Europeans. It was extraordinary. So what we have here is a situation where the whole beat up about the capacity, and it's nonsense about the capacity to build a nuclear weapon in the context of the time they had. We're talking about 60% enrichment of uranium. We're still talking about a time frame that's far longer than what was said to be the danger. That's one thing. Second thing is, as happened in 2003, the inspection reports were manipulated to give the impression of imminent danger. So what happened here is that the International Atomic Agency's report, which is what Netanyahu relied on, the Israeli government, was that supposedly the prevarications by the Iranians on the subject of whether they were genuinely truthful about certain regulations and whether they were abiding and so on, became the premise of suspicion that would lead to the construction of a weapon. They totally used that pretext to then initiate a strike reaction that we see. So we're talking about confection, deception, dissimulation, and a good deal of mendacity to force the issue about weapons that do not exist.
It's really incredible when you think about how hypocritical this whole operation is as well, because you had Israel who so arrogantly acted like they were untouchable for so long, this gross arrogance. And then after 4 days of few Iranian missiles, you have, I believe, 24 casualties or deaths in Israel as a result of these bombings, and they couldn't take it. And they questioned the courage and the strength of Gaza after 55,000 plus deaths, but they couldn't take just 4 days of this. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to get involved in this and come and try to save Israel?
Look, that's the question, isn't it? And this is one of the problems with the whole business with what Trump faces. Trump's, and I don't need to tell you this, you know very well, Trump's second term in the White House was premised on ending those wars, ending the never-ending wars and so on and so forth. What this looks like is a kind of a terrible prophecy. It was already being put forth by the likes of Walt and Mearsheimer in their study about the influence of the Jewish lobby in Washington politics and so forth. And I want to say, when I say Jewish lobby, I mean the Israeli lobby. I'm not suggesting something beyond that. But it is important to note that it is very influential. And what is happening at this moment is that that message of not being involved and putting the US Republic in the crosshairs is a very dangerous point in the business of the Trump administration. one of the hallmarks, and I always thought was very impressive about Trump's campaign and about his pedigree, was that he did not want to get involved in those things. But what is dangerous now is that he has a pressure group within his administration. There is a tension there about, wanting to deal and solve the Iranian issue, the issue with supposedly this incipient nuclear program. But that will involve, again, this problem of destabilizing a regime, very risky, possibility of collapse, very risky. Now, we can talk about it, and we can probably talk about it later, about the implications about what a post-Mullah Iran might look like. But the fact of the matter is, it is a very dangerous proposition. It is also based on the echoes of the very same rationale justifying the attack on Iraq again. If we remember, and I urge your listeners and your viewers to go to the State of Union address by George W. Bush in 2002, and that is, of course, the famous axis of evil speech. In the axis of evil speech, what he does is promote an idea, which is exactly what Netanyahu did in a few days ago. He justified the attacks currently happening on Iran as follows. He said, this is Netanyahu, that we cannot allow this devious regime to acquire these weapons because they will probably pass it on to proxies. What do we see in the 2002 address from President Bush? There is talk about the axis of evil. There is Iran, as the same culprits. We're talking about the same figures: Iran, Iraq, North Korea. And in this particular instance there, what we see is that these entities will have weapons of mass destruction that they will pass on to, guess what, proxies. So we know that that is a very dangerous line, and that's what we're seeing rerun now. So the language is a terrible reverberation about those things that have happened before. And I think this is something that, I hope Trump will not fall for. But I also think that there are some in the Trump administration who think that this is containable, that supposedly what the Israelis want is the bunker buster bomb, the B-57 being dropped from a stealth bomber on Fordo's reactor. But even then, there's not a guarantee of it being effective or anything like that. 3,000 centrifuges there and so on. It's the third one. It's the Israeli gem. They want to do that. The fact of the matter is, this is a very dangerous period in the context of this war, and it would be, I would urge, something unwise to pursue on the part of President Trump.
You mentioned George Bush's address on the Iraq War, the invasion, and what followed. Back then, there was a lot of public support, at least at the very start, for what George Bush was doing. But now we don't even see that with what's going on with Trump and Iran. I mean, Iran was a step too far even for George Bush. When he was initially, after 9/11, he was saying, we're going to go get these bastards, whatever. People like the idea. But right now, despite the fact there's been such a oversaturation of violence in our media and our culture, just showing us, like Collateral Damage, or Collateral Murder, the video from, I believe it was Afghanistan or Baghdad. I'm having a brain fart right now.
But from Baghdad, yes, that's right. New Baghdad.
Yeah. Right. Like, that was such a shocking video. I remember growing up, I'm like, oh my God, double tap strike. This is the most insane. Now that's just any old Tuesday, but people are not buying it. So how do you think this is going to impact Trump and his popularity at home? How do you think people are going to respond to this?
This is the thing, isn't it? The selling of it to me is absolutely incongruous. It's absolutely bizarre because, as you said rightly, in the context of Iraq, I mean, then you sort of, in the aftermath of 9/11, it was very febrile, very feverish. People were, of course, in that state of vulnerability, confusion and whatnot. They're being exploited like there was no tomorrow. And the various constituencies of the West, if you like, were being manipulated. But let's not also forget the huge protests that arose in response to the anticipated attack on Iraq. We're talking about protests like we have not seen before in terms of opposing, even in the peacetime protests taking place during the Cold War against nuclear weapons and urging nuclear disarmament. They still went ahead and attacked Iraq. But in this particular case here, there's something very strange going on which disturbs me, which is to say that the opposition and the disapproval is simply not there at the level of governments on the same scale. It is extraordinary, for example, that France, extraordinary that Germany, that these countries are more or less saying that Israel is still operating within the realms of Article 51 of the UN Charter, namely self-defense, of which, by the way, this is not the case. This is literally a Nuremberg crime against peace. There's a sort of a very fine line, between the notion of what is known as a preemptive strike and the notion of preemptive war. A preemptive strike is an imminent threat that you need to eradicate because it might be irreversible in the damage that it does to you, the threat, and so on, according to just war theory. But what we have here is preventive war. We're having here a hypothetical. We're having here an attack on a thought crime. So what we're doing is that we're seeing the Israelis attack Iran for having thoughts of acquiring a weapon, having thoughts of attacking Israel, having thoughts of these sorts of things. And what bothers me about it is that the outrage is simply not there in the governments stretching from Brussels to Berlin, even to London and across the board. And this, to me, is enormously difficult to fathom because, when you have someone like the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel openly speaking to a news outlet about the assassination, the contemplated murder of a head of state, namely the Ayatollah Khamenei, and there doesn't seem to be a rumble of disgust or outrage, that shows the extent about where we've come in this situation and how dangerous it's become.
What do you think about the UK? And they came out yesterday, I believe, and said that if the US goes in, then we'll seriously consider going in ourselves. I mean, I just have to ask with what army, I guess, because I'm sure they have something they can, scrap together and send over. But I'd imagine it's a pretty war-weary public in the UK right now, at least more so than it ever has been. The economic impacts from Russia's sanctions and this Russia war for the EU and also for the UK, it hasn't been great. And then now you're talking about something even further away. It's insane to me.
You're absolutely right about weariness and so forth. I mean, they're weary from the cost of living crisis, energy costs. They're weary about the Brexit decision, of course, where they left the European Union, and this is having an economic impact that's ongoing, and it's an ongoing debate. Starmer also, by the way, is leading a government which is quite, this is also remarkable. One of the largest majorities the Labour Party ever got in an election in the UK. It's absolutely stonking, formidable, hefty. And yet he is one of the most unpopular prime ministers in the history of electoral polling.
It's impressive.
It's impressive, isn't it? I mean, he's got a huge majority. He can more or less do what he wants, and yet he's so unpopular. So the idea of moving in engaging in this will be just absolute genius if that's the case. And you make the very good point, the very salient point about do they have the means of doing so? The fact is they don't. They barely have military resources that are up to the task. They just had a strategic defense review done that was complaining about the diminishing morale in the forces, diminishing recruitment numbers. They don't meet the targets on an annual basis. They're trying to make up the numbers at the moment. They also have a lethargic submarine fleet. Half of it doesn't work. They also have an issue with equipment failures, equipment problems. I mean, the only ones they're going to send are probably the SAS, their elite troops, half naked, with a very limited ration supply, fighting on the side of the Americans. But even then, it's not going to make much of a difference. This is, of course, solidarity. The UK has made it its option or its primary imperative when it comes to post-Cold War policy to support the United States in virtually every endeavor. The only endeavor, by the way, which it did not seriously involve itself, and this was a big debate in the UK, was, of course, the Vietnam War. But generally speaking, the UK can be counted to be on the side of the United States when it comes to an involvement. The same thing, by the way, with Australia. I'm actually slightly concerned from my side of the park as well to see there is a possibility, because Australia will always send in, call it the Anglophone states or whatever you want to call them, the Anglosphere, to use an expression that's been put out before. And this spreads the issue. This really becomes, again, the issue of Middle Eastern politics, Western powers in the Middle East. And I think you yourself, you're very familiar with the history of intervention in Iran before. Mohammad Mossadegh being overthrown in 1953 by a UK-US sponsored coup, replacing Mossadegh with, for goodness sake, an externally imposed Shah, a Byzantine monarchy that was then imposed on it, which created the ferment and the circumstances that led ultimately to the triumph of the mullahs and the triumph of the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. So there is something deeply troubling about this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Iran and what this could possibly unfold into, maybe we should just break it down like this, because I think this is a better way of doing it. How do you think they could possibly achieve a regime change in Iran? Because this is now what we're actually seeing them say. It's nukes, but now it's regime change, right? And how do you think they could do that? What would be the necessary levers, whether it's military means or proxies or economic destabilization, to try and make this happen?
The classic method of destabilizing a regime, and the United States knows this better than most, is, of course, things like economic destabilization, cultivating groups within the context of the country. Always make sure you throw in words like democracy. That always sounds good. Always make sure you throw in words like freedom, and preferably attach it to a foundation. That always looks good. And when you put all of these things together, that's one way of doing it, and it destabilizes within the country and so on. Look, let's face it. There is a lot of unpopularity in terms of the theocratic element in Iran. It is a controversial, very difficult regime in a sense, but the point is the Iranians ultimately have to be the ones to deal with that. And the protest movements that have taken place sporadically ever since the Arab Spring, but also the last couple of years and so on, is indicative that there is a groundswell underneath all of this. Netanyahu is, for purely opportunistic reasons, trying to exploit this by suggesting that by killing off the intelligentsia, or the military intelligentsia, if you like, in the scientific community connected with the nuclear weapon, that this somehow will create some overreaching kind of desire to overthrow the mullahs. The fact is, history shows time and time again that, and it happened, let's face it, I'm just thinking, for example, of what happened when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in, of course, Operation Barbarossa. And the initial stages of 1941, in the summer of 1941, was they were greeted by people with flowers in Ukraine. They were greeted in the Baltic states, people with flowers. They were seen as liberators. Commissars were being hanged right, left, center. The NKVD was being banished, the secret police of the Soviet Union. All of this was being done. And then things became nasty. And then it became very clear there was something else in the books. And eventually the Soviets, of course, reacted, and it then became the Great Patriotic War that is part of Russian mythology. So I do think it's important to remember that, when you attack a country, be careful what you wish for, and be careful about this kind of patronizing attitude that is used, that there are the subjects of our charity, there are the subjects that require liberation, and we can deliver this liberation in spades. It doesn't quite work out that way. True, there might be an initial welcome with flowers, but then they might be tossing you on bayonets at the end of the day.
Yep, I think that's a very, very realistic possibility here. Do you think that possibly they'll try to utilize, the age-old tactic of balkanization, for example, because they want to do it in Russia, they tried, they want to do it in China, they tried, and I think that maybe we could see efforts of that. I've seen some videos going viral, some rebel leaders starting to make some interesting Jolani-esque videos, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, this is precisely one of the dangers. And I think, again, we see the reruns of interventions in the Middle East where you start to put out the feelers and try to cultivate groups of individuals who are supposedly supping from the cup of freedom. I mean, nothing of the sort. They're just alternative, vicious militias. There might be a different kind of shade of fundamentalism. There might be a different shade of extremism, whatever it might be. It doesn't actually change the picture. Iran is a very complex society, much like Iraq. And I think many don't seem to understand that this, I think you may have seen that encounter, that rather fiery encounter between Tucker Carlson and Senator Cruz, where there's a discussion about, I recommend, so it's about Iran, it's about the potential attack on Iran. And, Carlson is sort of saying, do you understand the implications of attacking Iran? And of course, Cruz has no idea about the ethnic composition of Iran. And the fact is that Iran has, of course, the famous Persian element, which is their pride and joy, the 60% or so, but it's also got, groupings of Turkic individuals. It's got the Azeris. It's got a range of ethnic groups that have been vying for power in Iran for centuries. Usually it's Persians that tend to, of course, have dominant sway there. But the reason why we don't, and we have seen individuals such as, or the groups like the mullahs, and we've seen the problems of authoritarian rule, has been simply because there's a dominant group always trying to take charge. And so that is very susceptible to manipulation and attack and use. And as you were saying rightly before, with Jolani, with the Syrian aspect, each Western power has its horse it wants to back, and had its horse it wanted to back to overthrow Assad. And so the danger here is that we're going to see a situation, although on greater scale. We're talking about a very significant scale of influence here. We're talking about the beacon of Shia Islam here. And this is very dangerous. We're talking about, imagine the equivalent would be the overthrow and destabilization of Saudi Arabia, which is the beacon of Sunni Islam. And the implications there would be horrendous too. So you can just imagine the implications there and why this would be such a horrendous idea. But I'm sure it's a horrendous idea being entertained in certain circles.
Yeah, it definitely is right now. That's for sure. There's a war going on, I think, in the National Security Council about it. One last question for you, though. There's something that Said Hassan Nasrallah once said, and he was giving a speech. He was basically talking about the fact that Israel is its own worst enemy and that it's introducing too much chaos, too much violence, bloodshed into the equation. And when you do that, when you do all these regime change wars, proxy wars, destabilizations efforts, you're risking that the wrong people will come into power, or the people that are in power are going to react in a way that you don't predict. And that might just be the end of Israel. Do you think we're at a point now where, with Iran being threatened, Pakistan is starting to get worried? I'm not saying they're going to do anything today, tomorrow, the next day. Turkey's getting worried, though, as well. I mean, Erdogan is already maybe starting to see some of those IDF soldiers in Syria now. And it seems like this is maybe getting to be a little bit too much for one state of however many people it is, 9 million people or something like that in Israel. What do you think?
Well, yes, there is a case of Israel risking being not so much clever by half, but being clever by three quarters. They're trying to sort of make the effort now to expand beyond their security parameters. After 7th October, October 7th, 2023, there's been a very conscious effort to right what they perceive to be certain scores. Moving into, for example, Lebanon, moving into Syria after the collapse of the Assad regime, trying to grab territory, trying to grab these so-called corridors and buffer zones and whatnot. And yes, the pet delight of Netanyahu was always to knock out the Iranian nuclear program. It is something he really wanted to do for years. So In terms of that point you mentioned, that Israel essentially is creating the very same basis of undermining its own security. This is what it's done for decades. Israel created Hamas essentially by creating the conditions of appalling squalor and despair in Gaza, for example, that did lead to the creation by Sheikh Yassin of the group from the Muslim Brotherhood connected with Egypt that ended up setting up a base that ended up becoming Hamas. And then what the Israelis did, and do not forget, if ever you encounter anybody who doesn't seem to know this on the Israeli side, ask them this. Individuals like Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, the very hawkish pro-settler finance minister in the Israeli administration, openly said that Hamas was a good thing. And he said that because Hamas is a good thing. This is 5 years ago. This is about, no, maybe it's coming 8 years ago. Let's say 8 years ago. I think that's about right in the chronology, where he said that it's a good thing because it limits Palestinian independence. It neutralizes Palestinian independence because they combat Fatah and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, elements the Palestinian authorities in West Bank. The same thing with Netanyahu. Netanyahu, remember, this is one of the reasons why the man always has a cloud over him. He approved of funding from Qatari sources, funding Hamas for years. He actually said openly in a Likud meeting, in a meeting with officials from Likud, his party, that we should allow these suitcases filled with cash from Qatar across into Gaza, essentially to fund operations of Hamas. Hamas was, of course, doing welfare things, running hospital services, a range of other things, in addition to obviously getting weapons. But he actually approved of this. So this is the strange thing about this picture. Israel creates its own bombs that it tends to step on, and then brilliantly comes up with some solution. Okay, we now need to really get rid of these people, having created the very premise of their own demise. So that's their danger. Are they creating the next round of problems in this context? And that's the danger.
Well, I hope that we don't have new enemies for Israel in Iran, because I think if there's new enemies like these, potential Al-Qaeda cells, ISIS cells, it's going to be a lot more dangerous for the people in Iran themselves. But that is probably exactly what Israel wants. So, Dr. Benoit Kampmark, thank you so much for joining me today. Where should people follow along with you if they want to stay up to date with your work, your writing, and everything else you got?
Well, I mean, just on X, at B Kampmark, and also Counterpunch, which is the daily publication that's put out, along with a special plus edition for those who want to subscribe. But it's available, widely read, and I do recommend it. We do cover the Middle East a lot, and we're certainly covering the crisis extensively. So I do recommend your viewers and readers to consult that to get, hopefully, a more enlightened, if perhaps sometimes bleaker view of the world.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Anytime.